Okay. The story of Seabrook Farms isn't just about vegetables. It's about vision, power, and the price of success. And today we welcome John Seabrook to discuss his new book called The Spinach King, The Rise and Fall of an American Dynasty. And this book has been compared to the story from Succession, the TV show, where you have just many generations of competition in business and bitterness and betrayal. And it's an absolutely fascinating story. And John writes about his family's legacy in a very poignant, meaningful way. So, by way of introduction, John Seabrook. John earned his BA in English from Princeton University and his master's in English literature from Oxford. He has been a contributing writer, excuse me, for The New Yorker since 1989, and he became a staff writer in 1993. John's writing has also been published in Harper's, Vanity Fair, and GQ, among many others. And his writing, in addition to The Spinach King, John has written 5 books, including Deeper and The Song Machine. So, John, welcome. We're thrilled to have you today. And we always start by asking our guests about a particular bend in the road, a change, an event, something unexpected that happened that sort of altered the path of where you thought you were going. So, welcome and tell us about one of your bends.
Oh yeah, well thanks, Roberta. It's nice to hear you talking in your New Jersey accent. I
Oh,
appreciate
no,
it.
really?
Yeah, I appreciate it. No, I'm from New Jersey, so
Oh, that's great.
and this is a book about New Jersey, a part of New Jersey that, people don't know. And so yeah, I try to keep it Jersey if I can.
Yeah.
But of course, we root for the Eagles and the Giants and different teams. Well, we won't get into that. Yeah, so I guess a bend in the road for me really was taking this literature of fact course that I took in college at Princeton, which was taught by John McPhee. It was kind of unique to Princeton. John McPhee, as a lot of people will know, was a New Yorker writer, still is, and an inspiration to many, including me. And he taught a course basically in how to write for the New Yorker, kind of. I mean, that wasn't what it was called, but it was called the literature of fact. But it was basically long form nonfiction. I sort of had literary ambitions, but I really thought fiction was what I wanted to do. It was in those days, about the great American novel was kind of, if you were ambitious, that was sort of what you wanted to do. And I hadn't really thought that much about writing nonfiction, but it turned out I was much better at writing nonfiction, and it suited my talents and gifts and then lack thereof pretty well. And so that really was a huge bend in the road for me, and also realizing that the New Yorker existed as this old institution, which sort of appealed to my more kind of conservative family that didn't really want me just being a writer off on my own, writing fiction somewhere, being associated with an institution, but also being able to be creative and do what I wanted to do. That was the special thing that I realized that existed, and it still exists, which is incredible. It's just we just turned 100 this year.
That's
So,
amazing. That's
yeah.
incredible. Um, I mean, it is really the mecca when you think about it, like just to have these, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, poetry, any form of writing, it is the gold standard. I think a lot of people would still agree. And I think, did I hear that you described your nonfiction, especially your personal writing, as a reported memoir, or maybe somebody described it as,
Yeah, I describe it that
yeah.
way.
Hey,
And the
tell
reason,
us about that.
well, because the Spinach King is a memoir, but my family happens to have been involved in 20th century historical events that everyone was touched by. The two wars in particular, immigration and how it affected the workforce, and then the backlash against immigration, which sort of echoes with some of the things that's happening today. And then, sort of modernity and veg and food, but like processing and big agriculture and mechanization. There are all these events that a lot of families went through in different ways or were affected by. And my family was sort of at the center of. So, and a lot of it I didn't know when I started out because the family business ended the year I was born, really. And there was this big explosion between my father and his father, which I didn't really know many of the details of at the time. And what I did know was quite a different story than the story that I eventually learned. I was always just kind of curious to know more, and eventually, when I became a journalist, I started basically kind of investigating my family, or sort
Right.
of, and it was stuff that happened, in the 1930s and 1940s, but because of all of the resources that the internet had made online, all these local newspapers, all these records, court cases, you can find a lot that you didn't used to be able to find, and so I found out all this stuff, and some of it was very, damaging to my family, I guess, to our reputation. The Seabrooks were this sort of exemplary family. They were a big part of the brand. The Seabrook Farms brand was sort of built around this. The fact there was this real family of a father and his three sons. It was a big marketing point. It was sold as a story. Life magazine did a whole, 4-page spread on the Seabrook family and our farm in 1955. So, it was important that the family, kind of be at the center of these things. And yeah, my family turns out to have been an extremely competitive group of men. Then their father seems like he was something of a sociopath. And I didn't really know that when I started out. Yeah.
So I
So,
so let's set the stage because, like you said, this is an unbelievably rich, complex story that's generations, right? Takes place over the course of many generations. So I love that idea, especially of all of the sons, all the legacy and the leadership styles and the visionary, the people who have the talent, the people who don't, the appearances. So if you could tell us, like, in a nutshell, like just the whole background of the company, but like you said, there's perception. It's what they put forth, what your ancestors put forth, and then what the reality was,
right.
and when you realized that. So, if you could provide and then the technology too, with the frozen vegetables and meeting Charles Birdseye. So, give
Yeah.
us like a quick
Okay,
overview, and then
I'll
we
give
can
you
delve.
the, yeah, they'll give you. So my family came to southern New Jersey at the late 19th century. My great grandfather learned how to grow vegetables, and that part of New Jersey at that time, it was the reason that Jersey is called the Garden State is because people like my great grandfather were what were called market gardeners, or sometimes they were called truck farmers, and they grew vegetables for people in New York and Philadelphia. And that part of New Jersey was full of market gardens, and so that was why it was called the Garden State. So my grandfather was born on that farm. It was like a 60-acre farm, but he wasn't satisfied to be a farmer. He wanted to be like an industrialist, and Henry Ford was his inspiration. And so he found a way to borrow money. He sort of cheated his father out of the land, that what it was worth, which is kind of the original sin in this story. And then he was able to build up this big kind of factory that processed vegetables. He met Clarence Birdseye. Clarence Birdseye had invented the process of quick freezing because he had been in the Arctic and seen fish that were pulled out of the water freeze in this 40 degree below air
Mhm.
and then be reconstituted later. And he decided he could, reproduce that process in the laboratory. And he had done that for chicken and fish, but he hadn't done it for vegetables. And he knew my grandfather had this sort of industrial vegetable operation. And so he asked him to figure out how to apply his process to vegetables. And he and his sons, one of them was my dad, the youngest one. There were three of them, and they were all engineers. My grandfather was never an educated man, but his sons were educated, and two of them were Ivy League educated at Princeton. And they really were the ones that sort of figured out how to apply the bird's eye process to vegetables. And so Seabrook became really a pioneer in frozen vegetables. It did all of the bird's eye frozen vegetables up through the war. And then after the war, it started its own brand, which was Seabrook Farms, and it became very successful in the 50s. It packed a lot of frozen cream spinach. People know it from that. Lima beans. A lot of
I
people
know.
hate lima beans, and they hated them maybe, but Seabrook had a lot to do with lima beans because lima beans were a great vegetable for freezing, and they stood up very well to that process. At their peak, they had like 25,000 acres of their own, another 25,000 of contracted land. They had 8,000 workers at a time. My grandfather owned everything. He owned the land, he owned the majority of the business, he owned all the housing. And so everybody paid rent to him. So he really was this, and it was like 8 miles square of New Jersey.
Right.
He had this empire, and his sons were supposed to inherit this empire, and he told them they were going to inherit it. But at some point, he decided that he wanted it for himself, or he couldn't give it up. And so this succession battle you alluded to developed in the later 1950s, and it ended up sort of, dividing the family. Uh, Tearing the business apart and leaving these kind of unanswered questions about what really happened.
And the three sons, your father was known as Jack, is that right?
Yeah,
And so he had two brothers. And
it was Jack, there was Belford, who was the oldest, and he was the mechanical engineer. He was the guy that really knew about the factory and how to make things work. There was Courtney, who was the middle brother, and he was the one that really understood how to brand the product. And he came up with with all the branding stuff. And then Jack, who was my father, was kind of the financial guy, and that was ultimately the guy who became the CEO of the company, even though his brothers were older, because he was kind of like executive material. But the brothers got along. They had a sister as well, Thelma, who wanted to work in the business and even went to business school. But my grandfather was a real like anti-feminist. He wouldn't let women work in the business. He had a lot of very sort of bad qualities, and that was one of them. And but when the boys eventually decided the only way to save the company was to have their father committed, which they tried to do, it
wow.
was Thelma, his daughter, who sided with their father, my grandfather, and got him released. And then he disowned the boys, and then she got a lot of the money. So
Oh my, that's
that's how it
incredible.
ended. Yeah,
That's a twist that you won't even see on Succession.
I
So,
know.
so then the three brothers kind of grew up thinking that they would be the heirs, and since they each had different specialties, were they as competitive against each other because they had the plan and they worked together to push your
They weren't, they always stuck together because I think it was partly to survive their father. Their father wanted to divide them. That was part of his strategy for controlling them. And their mother would advise them to stick together. And their mother was a force for good, even though she was treated very poorly by her husband. That was my grandmother. She was a lovely woman who instilled humanity
Mhm.
in them, whereas their father, just this dog eat dog world that he lived in extended to his own family.
Right.
And that's in the book. My mother, part of the reason I think I have the perspective I have on this is that my mother was an outsider to all of this. And my mother came into it late in the game and saw what my grandfather was really like and how he treated his sons. And she wrote letters about it back to her family. She was from the Midwest. She was from South Dakota. Then her family was in different parts of the Midwest, and she would write a letter and with carbon paper and make copies and then keep the original. So I had all these letters that she basically it's like real time reporting on what
Right.
was going on as my grandfather was losing his marbles. And she was a journalist and a really evocative writer. And those letters, I think, are some of my favorite parts of the book, where you kind of hear it, what's happening from her perspective.
So that's interesting. So then so this grandmother's, the daughter, she was the one who kind of took the brothers or the grandfather to task, right? That's an interesting connection, right?
Well, the mother would never, like, when it came when so what happened was the board of directors of this company had the brothers, their father, and then the other directors were a range of sort of loyalists to, both some to my grandfather, some to my father. But the bankers, who were really the ones that called the shots because the company owed, them a lot of money, they said to my father and his brothers, look, if you don't remove your father from the board of directors, we will call our loans and the company will disappear.
Mhm.
And so the boys convinced themselves, and whatever, maybe correctly, that they were doing this to save the company.
Mhm.
And so that's the message they took to their mother and to their sister. And they said, but we all have to be united on this. If but their mother was always ambivalent about it. I mean, they were proposing to basically declare their father insane and commit him. And their sister, not understandably, was, well, where were you when I wanted to work with you before, and she was the one who'd always look after him when he was ill, or she stuck kind of by him more, and the boys were off running the company.
Right.
But that enraged the boys, when she ended up with much more than they got, because they felt like they were the ones that had earned it, in the company, and then she never worked in the company and ended up with the money.
Unbelievable. And I think the only time you met your grandfather, C.F. Seabrook, you were very, very young. And I think by that time, your grandfather already had signs of dementia.
Yeah,
And then so you kind of grew up here, or like the awareness now is of he was just cutthroat, brilliant, you know, it was very different from the vibe that you had when you met him because he didn't have his faculties and
didn't
more
have his
Catholic.
faculties.
Yeah.
I mean, I think he was one of these guys that didn't really mind what people thought of his methods.
Mhm.
And I don't think he cared, whether he followed the letter of the law or not. I think he wanted to get away with things. And he lived in a New Jersey politics, Camden. There was a lot of corruption. And he was involved not only with farming, but with public works. He built roads. One of the things I learned actually in reporting the book was that farmers back in the early 20th century were often road builders because, they needed paved roads. Like, cities pave roads in cities, but once you got out of the city, the roads were dirt. And so when it rained, and if you had goods to take to market, it would get stuck in the mud. So farmers had like an incentive, and they also had the materials and the machines, and the gravel and the men. So my grandfather would build roads during the winter months when he wanted to keep workers around, for the when the farm started up again, but he became a New Jersey highway commissioner, so he was using public funds to build. There's a beautiful road right from Seabrook, New Jersey to Camden. It's this 40-mile Route 77 now. And he built that road, right away, just to be able to get his stuff to Camden. So he was just, he lived at a time, the 20s, the roaring 20s. That was his heyday. There was a lot of corruption. There was a lot of money. He lived very large. But like a lot of people, it all came kind of crashing down for him. He went bankrupt at one point and had to kind of start again. He's a guy who maybe got the benefit of the doubt a lot, and it was the talents of other people that really got him. His father was an extremely talented vegetable grower, but he never gave his father credit for what he learned from him about farming. And his sons were extraordinarily talented in all these different areas that we were talking about,
And more formally educated than your grandfather?
and more formally educated. But he considered that like there was a class divide between like the Ivy League culture that they could access because they kind of came up in it, even if they weren't really the aristocrats that like other people who went to Princeton were, but they were aspirational. And my father looked great too. He was 8 inches taller than his father,
Yeah.
and he was very handsome. And in fact, one of the big um, blow-ups came over his girlfriend. Before my mother, my father dated the actress Ava Gabor.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
And if you know Ava Gabor from Green Acres, then you might not know that 10 years before Green Acres, she actually played that same role in real life when she would come down to Seabrook Farms as the sophisticated New York socialite
Sure.
and spend weekends, on the farm. And anyway, but my grandfather became so enamored of Ava Gabor that he wanted Ava Gabor for his. I mean, that's kind of how he operated. Like whatever he wanted,
You just got it.
didn't matter who stood in the way or
Right.
propriety or, you know, he was just, I think he was a narcissist probably. In those days, people didn't talk about narcissism, but, if you've been involved with a narcissist or you know someone or know something about it, he checks a lot of the boxes.
Right.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
he checks a lot of those boxes. And
So
so
now
my father learned to survive with a narcissist.
so that kind of leads into narcissists also, right? Sometimes they feel like they shouldn't have a place at the table. They're very bright, but they have a need to be worshipped. And I think you were
Worship.
saying that your father and maybe both your grandfather, like when they were putting together these workers, right? These are significant amount of workers that came from Japanese internment camps and African American migrant workers. So can you tell us about how they basically put all of these many workers together, and then the uprisings when finally they did want to represent themselves? And I want to share with our listeners two different clips. There was a more sanitized version of the experience that the workers had within these communities, right? They were also living there. So the Seabrooks were their landlords, and they had their kids in school there. So there's one sense of this was my community, and it was a wonderful, respectful place, and father was the benevolent guardian. But then the other side, and you can tell us about one of the most famous labor uprisings, and who was basically, the vigilantes and the KKK, like who was involved in that. So maybe tell us about the two different views of the owners.
Yeah, so Seabrook was sort of swimming against the stream of 20th century kind of labor in that they needed all these farm workers at a time when a lot of people were moving to cities and working in factories where they could get paid more and didn't have to be outside. And so they had to look farther and farther afield for workers. During the war, as you said, a couple thousand Japanese American families came from the internment camps in World War II, where they were confined during World War II, and were sort of free to leave Seabrook Farms after 6 months, but essentially lived in this kind of barracks-like situation that wasn't really a lot better than the camps that they'd left, and they were paying rent too. And then after the war, Estonians came from displaced persons camps in Europe, and then African American workers came from the South, and they had preceded the war, the Japanese American workers, but they had never been treated fairly by management. They'd always been let go first, paid less. They lived in the worst accommodations, even when new housing became available during the war for the Japanese Americans, they had seniority over them. They should have gotten that housing. So they decided to call a strike. And this event, which is a big part of the book, and it was an event that I had never heard a single thing about, before I started researching this. It had happened in 1934, so it had been 60, 70 years, but still, it was a major event. The company, I think, swept it under the carpet, partly because they came out looking bad. The African American workers decided to form a union. They called a strike. My grandfather went ballistic. He called in these local farmers as vigilantes, armed them with axe handles, and they some had shotguns. And he also spoke with the local KKK. It was at a time when the KKK was kind of on the rise again, and even in New Jersey, there was a KKK, and they were eager to help because, it fit in with their ideology. And there were these amazing photographs taken that I uncovered, these top-notch photojournalists had gone because the story really was covered widely in the New York Times, the New York Post, the Philadelphia Inquirer. And I came across all these pictures. There was even video of these women, black Jamaican born women in white uniforms pulling beets off of a truck during the strike because scabs were attempting to harvest these beets. And it's amazing. I found it on YouTube. It's just again,
Wow.
it's just sort of amazing history. If you write about history or certainly history within our time, YouTube and the internet has just brought all these primary materials available to you. So that was just as a writer, almost anything you want to know now, you can kind of ask the internet or something,
Right.
and it will show you something or tell you something. Anyway, so yeah, that happened. Unfortunately, the strike didn't succeed immediately, and the workers were fired by my grandfather. But eventually, the company did unionize. My father was involved in a lot of that. Another thing I realized in reporting this is that my father had pushed for all these kind of liberal, sort of quote unquote, liberal policies that by the time I knew him, he was much older and he had been through a lot of conflict with his father over these policies. And he was kind of conservative. And he would often sort of accuse me of being the liberal,
Right.
the hot-eyed liberal with these kind of impractical notions. But he was the one that pushed for the union. And he also pushed to integrate the plant, which my grandfather opposed. He was progressive. He was 40 years younger than his father, so it was almost two generations younger. And he had great ideas for how frozen orange juice was a new thing in the 50s. He saw that coming. My grandfather was totally opposed to that because that wasn't their business. A lot of the brand, once you had the brand and you could sort of do what you did in New Jersey in the West Coast and brand it, then it became cheaper because California, the growing season's longer, that you didn't have to truck things over there. You could, grow different kinds of things. And so of course, Seabrook wanted to develop operations in Florida and California. But for my grandfather, Seabrook, New Jersey was his entire power base. That was why Henry Ford, I think, was so inspiring to him, is like Ford did it all right there in, Ford's land with Ford's people. And that was where Ford was a big man. And so for my grandfather, Seabrook, New Jersey was where he was like this, almost like a demigod. The workers particularly from the displaced persons camps the Estonians, he had personally sponsored them. And for them, it was maybe either coming to Seabrook or going back to what was then Soviet occupied Estonia and maybe a prison camp. So yeah, he played a big role in their personal mythologies, and there's a museum that exists down there in South Jersey, which you can go and visit, which was created by the Japanese American and the Estonian workers to kind of memorialize their part of the Seabrook story
Um,
in a very positive,
Right.
company-friendly way.
Right. And that
Right,
kind of propped up his what he wanted to present as himself as, sort of a savior to certain
right.
groups of people. And then so it's so interesting, like I can really hear the respect and awe that you have for all of, the three generations of family members before you, just the innovation and the creativity, like it's so evident. And then just the heartbreak with the character and the things that happen. So
Yeah.
but I mean, growing up, how did you decide? And I know that was very hard, deciding to write this memoir about this specific area, and that's your blood, that's your line too.
Right.
How and why? Like you have a son and a daughter, and I know that you want to represent the good part of the family and the more negative things because that's reality. How and when did you decide at some point that you did want to get this down and get the story out?
Yeah, so I grew up with, the sort of sanitized version of the family story. And even when I wasn't writing about the family, a lot of the things I was writing about were in some ways influenced by my experience within this family. Like engineers, for example, are often in my articles for the New Yorker.
Yeah.
And that's partly because I grew up with engineers, and I'm not, and I never really had that kind of gift, but I was always fascinated by people like my father and his uncles who did, and also some of their, my cousins uh, are very sort of, good engineers. And my brother's a pretty good engineer too. So there's like kind of a culture of engineers that influence my work and also just business. I write about business, I write about money, I write about invention.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that my music book. I mean, that part of the reason that I was interested in pop music and pop songs is that they are like these inventions, these kind of eureka moments that only happen fairly rarely, but are very lucrative, and you kind of want to have happen more often, but seem to have like kind of a life of their own. And so it's that sort of border between like creativity and then the economy of that creativity and then just the kind of work that goes into it. It's always fascinated me.
Right.
So that I get from my family. I credit my family. In the book, I talk about how like the boil in the bag innovation in frozen food, which the Seabrooks had a lot to do with it. The mylar, this material that the DuPont developed during the war. My uncle had, knowledge of. He'd go to DuPont and he knew what they were working on, and that made it possible to have prepared food. So you could pre-cook like frozen cream spinach, for
Right.
example, and then you could put it in the bag. And then all you had to do to cook it was to take it out of the packaging and put the bag in hot water. To me, that was like a brilliant idea. Like
Brilliant. I don't think we knew that. I didn't know that until I was reading about this, that it's
I have there's a
pre-cooked.
movie called Flash of Genius, which was based on one of my New Yorker articles. There's another book of mine called Flash of Genius, and it's about this guy who came up with the idea for the first intermittent windshield wiper, and then he fought this long patent battle to get paid for it. And the reason, I mean, I have to say that the Flash of Genius I was first interested in that really because of that Mylar pouch that I felt was like a flash of genius. And actually, funnily enough, later I learned that the film 2001, the Stanley Kubrick
Yeah.
film, if you watch it like with a remote control and stop it when they're eating on the way to the moon, they have like this meal.
Yeah.
It's sort of early in the film, and they have this, and they're squeezing this kind of gross, yucky taste. And if you look at the packaging, it says Seabrook Farms.
I watched that. I was blown away by, and it just shows how futuristic it was at the time, right? That was
Right. It,
Stanley
it
Kubrick's.
seemed very futuristic,
It's
and
amazing.
it was pretty. I mean, I think frozen food got a little bit of a bad rap because there was a race to the bottom. There was a lot of salt and fat used. It was not the high-end product that it started out as marketed. It
Mhm.
was, in the 50s, like, they were sort of, it was a superior class of customer that had the freezer, the Frigidaire
Yeah,
freezer and because you needed all of that, and it was part of being like a modern, sophisticated person.
right. Yeah.
But it sort of lost some of its allure over the years. I feel like,
Oh, I don't, I think people are, I mean, when you think about like smoothies and all the, I mean,
Oh
frozen,
yeah,
oh, yeah.
right,
So I want to ask you about your New Yorker before we close. I love so you mentioned engineering, right? There's articles on e-scooters, like e-scooters loved by Silicon Valley. Like, is New York City ready for those? And then yeah, okay, I want you to tell me about your next article that's coming up in the New Yorker, and any one of these from the past, Johnny Marr with his guitars, uh,
yeah.
The Women of Wet Leg, how Rian Teasdale and Hester Chambers, two friends from the Isle of Wight, got a music career and 5 Grammy nominations by fixing on an old chaise longue. I mean, every single one of your very long titles makes me want to just jump in, and they're phenomenal. So tell me about like a new one and maybe
Yeah.
one of your greatest hits from the past.
Well, yeah. So people who know my work maybe know my music writing. I had a piece that led to a book. It was called The Song Machine, and it was really about how modern pop music is made.
Mhm.
And this was maybe 10 years ago. A lot of people at that point maybe they still don't know that, the people who sing the songs rarely write them, and the people who write the songs are often these professionals that work in these communities of songwriting, and they're all kind of searching for a hit. They're not looking for an album's worth of meaningful work. They're really there to create hits for Katy Perry or Rihanna or Britney Spears, and it just so happens that a lot of them are Swedes, and they come from Sweden, and all came from this one group of musicians and DJs that gathered in Stockholm in the 90s. And then Britney Spears' "Hit Me Baby One More Time" was created there, and then that whole sort of revolution in pop music brought them here, and the Taylor Swift's most recent song, "Fate of Olivia," is the same guys, the Swedes, the same people, the same
Wow.
guy who wrote "Hit Me Baby One More Time" in 1997 wrote "The Fate of Olivia" in 2025. So they've been doing it for a long time, and clearly they have this special gift that a lot of people would love to have because it's like the gift of printing money, basically, but very few do. So and that, like I said, it sort of fits into my kind of the flash of genius, the moment when something clicks, and often I find in my work. Like taking a walk and trying to figure something out, and it's not when I'm sitting at the computer. Maybe it's not genius, but like the way the problems are solved and the way creativity works, it's always been an interest of mine. The thing I'm working on now is actually about stadiums and how stadiums have gone from being these kind of working class cathedrals to being these kind of high-end mall, like, 4 or 5 star hotel experience with celebrity chefs, and the price of them has gone from being affordable to basically not being
Even for a hot dog, there's
for,
nothing
yeah,
affordable
yeah,
anymore, right?
not, yeah, to parking, hot dog, a drink, the traffic, and then sitting outside. It's a lot of people, it's just not worth it. And but the people who have a lot of money will go, for the piece is called The Fan Experience. and it's kind of about how, the experienced economy has now extended to so many different kind of marketing and consumer based, it's no longer a thing, it's an experience, right? This is like the kind of mantra of the millennial mindset. And post-pandemic, that really kind of got, I think, kicked into high gear that people are willing to spend, first of all, they have money to spend, and second of all, they're willing to spend on experiences because that's what they really realized was what life is really all about. And the pandemic taught them that. So, yeah, this is about going to a couple of new stadiums. When I write, I'm often like kind of your guide. It is sort of first person in the sense that I'm there, but it's not really first person in the sense that I'm really telling you that much about what I think or feel. I'm trying to be kind of, I mean, quote unquote, objective. I don't impute thoughts to myself while I'm there. As I stood next to him, I was thinking,
Right.
I don't do that. Everything
Right.
is like what I can see and hear.
Right.
But I do kind of like to be and I learned this really writing about technology is that if you write about technology as a user, you become a kind of a go-between between the reader and the technology, which itself is kind of sterile and often confusing and off-putting, but you can kind of write about your experience with the technology, and then that makes it human.
Right.
So I sort of learned to do that writing about email and the internet. That was what my first book was about.
Okay.
But now I sort of try to write more about culture, how it kind of impacts our all of our experiences out there in the great American marketplace.
Well, you're so right. Like a stadium is a way into these bigger themes. I'm just like the minute you said that, I'm just thinking about like the difference between like going to a Packers game, right? Those folks don't want anything glamorized. They don't want a roof. They want to be freezing cold. It's
Right.
hardcore. And then like the newer stadiums for the Olympics or whatever. These are so exciting.
That's where
Yeah.
my piece starts out in
And then when you think
California.
of like the corporate boxes, you have people going to shows, to concerts at these stadiums,
Oh yeah.
arenas, and it's often not the people who really should. Not, I shouldn't say this, but the people who are in the boxes are not always the fans that would be
Oh,
beside themselves, and
never,
that's what's heartbreaking. Whether it's a game or
never.
a show, it's hard, but that's a fantastic topic. My
Yeah, I
God.
went to one of those and I sat in a corporate. I went to a Beyonce show and I sat in a corporate box
Oh
and
wow.
it was dead.
Yeah, I know exactly. No one's paying
It was
attention.
like for schmoozing.
Oh
Yeah.
my gosh. No, that's just not right. That's like when you're on the floor, right? You're on Florida Stadium, you're standing the whole time at the Garden, and it's just so exciting. And you're with people who were crazy enough to get those early tickets. And I hate that it's so expensive, of course.
Yeah, it
Anyway.
is really expensive
Oh, well,
now.
that's we're excited. I will definitely include all
They'll be out in December 1st. So the
December. Okay,
day after Thanksgiving.
I'm gonna put this in the show notes too. So, John, I want to before we close, I always like to ask our guests, what is something that you reach for when you need some hope?
Yeah, I appreciate that question because I thought about it when I was taking my walk with the dog earlier. First of all, I love my dog. I often get
Yeah.
inspiration
What's your
from
dog's name?
Herman.
Herman. Wonderful.
He's just a big, shaggy goofball, and his attitude always cheers me up. I love like interacting with young people in the course of because I do write about sort of pop culture stuff. I get this sort of rare chance to actually talk to people who are in their, 20s and 30s. I'm always inspired by like young people who are trying to figure this world out that they are now, inheriting and how they're coping with AI and I have kids right in that range too. I have a 26-year-old and a 17-year-old. But I'm kind of an optimist, I think, basically. Part of the reason I like to write about technology is, I sort of do sort of believe in progress. And I'm always excited when technology yields like a new drug discovery, the stuff that's happening with drug discovery thanks to AI. I find really kind of inspiring, the idea that a lot of diseases that we are still, heir to won't exist in 30 years. Mainly, I mean, Alzheimer's being the big one, I guess.
Right.
I'm inspired by breakthroughs in those areas, and even though politics seems like it goes backwards sometimes, hopefully, we'll find a way
Absolutely.
through
Yeah.
this time to a better time. Yeah, yeah,
John, thank you so much. This has been such a fascinating conversation, and I'm going to share a lot of the links. I think folks will be really fascinated to see some of these short videos on YouTube and some photos.
yeah.
So I'm going to link all of that. So I encourage people to check out the Spinach King and some of John's links and the New Yorker, and I'll put your website in there too.
Cool. All
Thank you
right.
so much for sharing this story, John.
Been fun. Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, anything do you want to add or change or
No, I thought that was
good?
you got it. Yeah, you want me to keep this open, probably, don't you, in this box for a while till
Oh, I'm
you.
gonna as soon as we finish, then I'll log off. I just wanted to make sure there was nothing else that you wanted
Oh
to.
yeah, I'm good. No, I thought
Wonderful.
that was great. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Fantastic. Like it's and these photos, these they're so dramatic
I
and
know.
glamour. I can literally even